Now it's my pleasure to present today's presenter, Peyton Marshall. Peyton has extensive leadership experience in the healthcare and IT sectors, and as CEO of LeveragePoint, he works with some of the world's leading B2B companies to quantify and communicate the value they provide to their customers. So with no further ado, Peyton, welcome.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here today, and thank you all for joining us. So people use the term value propositions in many ways, but the successful value propositions that we see are value narratives or value stories that transcend the math. Because a value proposition, any way you cut it, answers the business outcome question. What do we do for our customers? So the great value propositions turn product monologues into customer-centric conversations. For those of you who don't know us that well, LeveragePoint is a platform for value propositions. We apply a value lens to commercial strategy and execution. And looking at the world through a value lens, it can help you in better decision-making, setting good value-based prices, but also using the value and the customer value to think more clearly about customer segmentation. As you think about segmentation, you can think about offer creation. That then may come to some good pricing segmentation and ultimately to good messages and good communication strategies. And having done that work, the ability to quickly convert that into a communication tool improves execution. So that's faster sales cycles, higher margins, higher close rates, and better product launches. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and that is as LeveragePoint customers use value stories, they focus on customer outcomes, and that generates measured, delivered success. Higher win rates, higher prices, higher profitability, shorter sales cycles. So from that vantage point, it's been interesting over the last few years as we work with different people in our community and among our client base. And as we've done that, we've gotten a lot of windows into sustainability and sustainability as an increasingly important theme and element in looking at your differentiation and thinking about your differentiated value. So the elements of that include dollarizing sustainability value, getting very directly to the middle of this picture. But also, as companies with innovative offerings come in, they look increasingly to track sustainability metrics in their innovation. So we see that important in the innovation process where we're often involved. Once you've thought about value, thinking about pricing approaches, policies, as you consider your pricing with sustainability elements in your offering can be an important thing to do. And as you've understood sustainability, it really starts to point to a lot of ways that your customer base is segmented. And the more you understand that segmentation, the more you can think about offer creation and design to fit the value, as well as better messages. Once you've done that, then it's all about how do you sell the value? And we see that materializing in value propositions as they're executed among our client base. So we thought today was a good point in our journey to pull the community together and compare notes, to really look at what are some of the important themes that we see. And in doing that, each one of the topics here is probably, anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour and a half in its own right. So we wanted to really kind of take a high level view today, look at the changing landscape for sustainability and ESG, because those two terms get blended together in B2B. But we really want to come at this from the standpoint of three pretty different kinds of examples of sustainability and value propositions, and use those examples to at least get people thinking about the ways that they might consider improving their communication, their differentiation, and their value. And at the end, we'll just do a few outtakes and a few observations on best practices, at least based on where we are in the journey for value propositions in an ever-changing ESG world. So let's start with the landscape. And I think it's always good to think about really what's going on, really sort of at a first level. There are the emerging politics, which are, of course, are coming from decades of policy and science and scientific debate, really thinking about climate goals, but other elements in terms of sustainability. And so we had that all-important event in 2015, the Paris Accords, really that I think increasingly has a number of companies putting laws and regulations in place. That includes companies, municipalities, governments measuring, reporting, and as the laws are put in place, potential penalties. Now, that's all come about at the same time that the themes of responsible equity investing are getting increasing focus. So there's the socially responsible funds from long back, but now ESG investing has become a very important general theme, particularly in the equity markets, but even in the debt markets in terms of outperformance for fund managers. And as investors are doing that, then sustainability reports and disclosure are becoming increasingly important. So that starts with disclosing risk for public companies, but now more and more it's about reporting GHG emissions. And if you've been tracking the debate in US politics and particularly the SEC lately, you'll be aware that there are proposals in front of the SEC, or rather proposals the SEC has already put forward to require GHG emission reporting. So watch this space. Then the next element of this really is about demographic changes and about attitude changes in the broader population. Some of that is, what I think would be identified as an increasing focus, particularly among millennials and Gen Z, but, a broader concerned community. And when those communities are more concerned about sustainability, it's important for both employees and for customers. So companies begin to think about their mission, their culture, and how sustainability enters into it. Consumers demand products that are more sustainable. And as all of that occurs, then corporate and product branding become very important. So it's about verification of sustainability, even net zero products. So where that finally ends up is in this territory of C-suite goals, about which we'll have more to say in a minute. But it's about emission reduction goals and other sustainability goals, whether they're water, packaging, transport. And putting all this together, it means that B2B strategy and the strategy consulting firms and the blogosphere is focused more and more about measured, differentiated sustainability, because all these pressures are making that more important in the broader community. Now, that doesn't mean there's unanimity, and there's clearly plenty of resistance. We have our climate change deniers, including in the US political sphere, but also in Europe. Man-made global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated. There's clearly debate directly on emission disclosure and regulatory proposals. So the dissenting Securities and Exchange Commissioner put out this statement on the SEC site that is, we're not the Securities and Environment Commission, at least not yet. And finally, of course, people's attitudes, I think, are shifting even as they seek to get to consider climate targets. Here's a survey that I just came across this week. 58% of executives say their organization is guilty of greenwashing, conveying a false impression or giving misleading information that says that their products or practices are more environmentally friendly than they actually are. But despite these pushbacks, despite the sort of frictions, I think the trends are undeniable. 2015, 114 companies with science-based target initiative targets, and that's a special category. Now in 2021, we're up to 2,000 companies in that category. 30 to 35 trillion, depending who you ask, in sustainable investment strategy funds. 96% of global C-suite surveyed said that they have at least one sustainability program in their company. And so you really have to ask one way to ask the question. I went Googling to see if I could find any investors committed to let's short sustainable stocks as their investment strategy, and I couldn't find them. So let's start with a little bit of language. The very big picture is ESG and measuring and interpreting ESG. Where don't forget, ESG is environmental plus social plus governance. And that leads to some kind of overall concept. And the important investor debate really has been, what are the returns from ESG investing? Do active ESG strategies outperform? And even, is investing this way consistent with a fund manager's fiduciary duty? So there are now studies of all the studies, and one of these is from NYU recently, of over 1,000 academic studies, and the broad outcome of most of these studies, at least, is that ESG scores are somehow associated with better financial performance, whether it's ROE, ROA, higher alpha, better shareholder returns, and lower cost of capital. Now, the landscape is pretty confusing in terms of the actual measurements. And there are a number of ESG rating providers. I've listed a few as kind of the leading ones. But this is a world of very non-standardized reporting. There are 600 plus ESG raters. So the interviews of investors actually say they don't sit there and use the MSCI index and invest accordingly. They actually use the research in most cases to make selective investments. And the thing to realize as you look through all these ESG scores, they use different metrics. They use different weightings with different standards, even by industry. And I saw one study that said, if you look at among the leading ESG rating providers, there's only a correlation of about 0.61 among their scores. That compares to credit raters correlations that are 0.99. So one of the things as you look at ESG is this, of the three components, the environmental sustainability really has sort of taken a front row. Partly, I think, because it's more specific than overall ESG. You know, measurement can be science-based, can be more standardized, and even though there are interconnections between the E, the S, and the G, for some audiences at least, the E tends to come first. So, second term, sustainability from a company perspective means a lot of things. It can mean sustain my business, survive, generate returns, grow. It can mean very broadly protect nature with these four buckets in some of the measurements. So when you think about those two, you know, clearly it's always been important for reporting companies to monitor and disclose their risks. There's even a new push for risk disclosure across the nature-based buckets. But now, of course, what we have is discussion addressing specific problems. And in some ways, that isn't new. Specific problems have been around for decades in terms of water pollution, air pollution, toxic waste. But now, big theme, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. And I think will be, you know, we certainly heard from time to time non-renewable resources. But then there's the whole theme of endangered species and biodiversity. But we'll concentrate a lot of what we're talking about today really in and around GHG emissions and this move to set, measure, and meet goals. So a little bit on GHG, and let's start kind of in the middle of the slide with the reporting company and how they think about things, because every company emits greenhouse gases directly. You know, if they have factories, even their office use, as they are doing what they do, they are emitting greenhouse gases. But if you think about a reporting company in context, of course, there are upstream third-party activities, and they buy from suppliers, they buy from employees, and then there are among those upstream activities, there's a very important emission that is usually thought about quite early, and it's scope 2. So it's indirect emissions from purchased energy. And so companies, as they start, tend to set scope 1 and scope 2 goals. Now, if that's where you stop, it'd be pretty easy to cut down on GHG emissions by moving activities off balance sheet, moving them and contracting with third parties to do things that you used to do within your business. That's why, of course, it's, you know, as you look at this, though, scope 1 and 2 reporting are important. Usually it's the first set of targets. So 90% of the Forbes 2000. There are measurement guidelines, but they apply elsewhere. There are website calculators that you can look at. And there are now standards boards that sort of overlay some of the measurement guidelines. And even those different standards boards are kind of coming together to come up with common standards. But as I say, scope 1 and 2, really the place that people started, but the change really, and this is even in the SEC proposals, is to pay more and more attention to scope 3. And the first kind of scope 3 emissions are upstream in the value chain. So think of suppliers to the reporting company, where it may start at the material acquisition and processing stage, goes through into producers of intermediate goods for the reporting company, and transportation, distribution, and storage provided to them. But then there are downstream activities. And once products and services have been produced, of course, there's the distribution and storage of the products. Think delivery through, you know, Amazon, for example. There's the consumption and use of those products that may emit gases. And then there's end of life. So think of disposal and waste. So increasingly, companies are thinking about scope 3 goals. And of course, the SEC is thinking about scope 3 reporting. For many companies, these emissions are large, 65 to 95% of their total when they measure it. There are many different practices at present. I looked at one database that where it was about 16% of the companies in the database had some kind of scope 3 goal. And the reporting gets a little more variable. That is, what's within bounds may be subject to some options and judgment. You know, what you choose to measure within your value chain may be subject to some practical considerations. In theory, you're supposed to pick the important emissions, you know, but to you, or important financially emissions to you, as you think about your scope 3 emissions as measured. So just a few examples, we won't dwell on them. These are 4 companies that LeveragePoint clients call on. None of these are LeveragePoint clients. At one end, you've got Amazon with some pretty clear early net zero emission targets, some activities as part of their targets to get there pretty directly in terms of, if you like, subordinate targets by the near term, and some investment activities. It gets tricky for the energy companies, and of course there's an array among those in terms of their goals. Chevron, an interesting case where their goals are very nuanced. You can even see from the way they state some of their goals, just how they're trying to get there in stages, even how they are at least being transparent in what they include and what in the goals that they're talking about. Nestle, if there's here's one report that you may want to see of someone who's really thought about their net zero roadmap, and I recommend it as an example. So they've got high-level goals, and then they've got very specific goals on how they plan to get there, in some pretty specific ways in the near term, including even one global water category. So this is a product category that they're seeking to have be, quote, carbon neutral as a category by 2025. And finally, L'Oreal, again, one of the leading edge sustainability companies, where again you see some of their broad sustainability goals. I draw your attention to the last one here, which is they have direct goals for, quote, their strategic suppliers, where they want their strategic suppliers to reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% by 2030. So a little bit of leaning on their suppliers there. So the other aspect, of course, is sustainability is demographics and preferences. And this change in attitudes, starting on the employee side, it's of course the shift in the demographics to millennials and Gen Z. And then a lot of things that you find in some of the studied literature in terms of socially responsible firms having lower quit rates, firms with environmental standards, greater productivity, millennials in surveys saying it's important to choosing a job, even taking a pay cut. The other side of this is consumers, where increasingly, particularly in the branded area, it matters. It's important to spending. It can be important to willingness to pay among consumers. And in this world, brand transparency and reporting for brands, even verification for brands, is increasingly important. Now, with all that happening, it's no surprise that there are trends among procurement professionals. And so just a few sort of signs of that. It's increasing in terms of it being important. There are now communities of procurement professionals, some, just among themselves, a LinkedIn community initiated by some executives at Bayer and Henkel. But then, and then other councils moving along, award winners among procurement professionals. It's still early days. Here's a McKinsey survey in 2021 of chief procurement officers. And if you look at those who are really focused on it, have sustainability in their procurement strategies, it's still at the low end, 10%, 20% saying they use sustainability measures as primary criteria. But then a whole world of many of them really aspiring to implement more formal standards in procurement. And of course, McKinsey is pleased to help. Here are some of their suggestions. I think it's always good to know what procurement people are thinking about. This is their guidance in terms of steps toward a sustainable procurement strategy. So, a few observations. Sustainability and value props, quantifying the impacts. First, understand your product's sustainability differentiation. Some customers will want to know. Their brands are important. They have goals. They measure outcomes. Are your product's claims validated? What's the perceived quality of that validation? Does your offering ensure a more sustainable product for your customer? where is the sustainability impact in their value chain? Next, GHG emissions reductions are often a second dimension of many cost savings that your products provide. So your efficiency may mean scope 1, scope 2 emissions. Third, understand not just your product, but your company's sustainability differentiation. Your scope 1 and 2 are your customers' scope 3. They'll ask, can you help your customers with their scope 3? Are they going to make demands on your scopes 1 and 2? Can you structure different offerings with different sustainability characteristics? Next, segmentation surrounding sustainability is bound to be significant. Many companies already understand their scope 1 and 2 emissions. An increasing number are addressing their supply chain and their scope 3 emissions. Some will be open to partnerships to help set and achieve their GHG goals. Some will consider the price of carbon credits. Some will be climate change deniers. Some are just starting to think about it. And so there is this question, is the value of an improved sustainability brand or a better profile, is that a good conversation to have if you're a major supplier? It's certainly a strategic conversation. Next, all important as you think about value propositions, consider your use case. Are you looking for a transactional conversation? Are you looking to introduce a product? Is it a relationship conversation? What are your goals? Last observation is transparency really will be required. This question of perceived greenwashing and not being able to support, verify, back up claims of sustainability, the ability to deliver on your own quantitative elements will be increasingly required. Last comment, carbon credit markets, there is a price, and carbon credits are a long topic, but they are tradable certificates that are the right to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide, usually per metric ton. A single purchaser of a transferable contract retires the contract. Now, it's pretty interesting. Consensus best practices are try to meet emission targets without buying credits. And then you get into sort of the quality of the credits themselves, where I think there's a general sense that insets, those are credits bought within a value chain, are generally better than offsets, credits bought outside a value chain. There are many projects underway to generate credits and offsets. And there are a lot of criteria on what they are supposed to do. So understand there's a whole literature there. There are validating authorities, registries for contracts, and there are different perceived quality of some of the different contracts. So there are mandatory exchanges, say the EU ETS and the SCS in California, then a number of voluntary registries and exchanges. So prices all over the map. It's amazing. The EU mandatory price was probably 20, 25 bucks a year ago. When I looked last, it was at 87 bucks per metric ton. Voluntary markets typically lower, but all of these are priced per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So other greenhouse gases have a conversion factor to get to the price. And then finally, it is interesting, a number of companies have bought carbon credits so far, and across the spectrum, you can see who some of them are. So last comment on the price of carbon and credits. Don't forget what Warren Buffett said, price is what you pay, value is what you get. Your B2B customers are just coming to understand the value of meeting these goals and different ways of meeting goals with different risks and different costs. So that's an opportunity to collaborate and collaborate on value. So the old saying, value first, then price, is very applicable here. So with that, I want to look at 3 examples of sustainability and value propositions. And we'll do this at a very high level, but they are fundamentally different in character. So the first example is one of manufacturing efficiencies and sustainability. Dean Chemicals has a superior boiler technology. We've actually used this case study before. So equipment, software, and chemicals, it's kind of an investment decision if you're buying this technology that improves energy efficiency, water efficiency, and system reliability. So this is before we talk sustainability, this has a powerful value proposition. What's interesting, of course, is that there are sustainability implications of this value proposition, so that you can think in terms of emissions saved and even water saved for this one. And as we look at the value drivers, one important one is reduced use of natural gas. So if you think about that for any plant with a major industrial boiler, that's a direct reduction in consumer energy costs, but it's also a customer scope 1 reduction in GHG emissions. So you have this question of to dollarize or not to dollarize. So let's flip to a value proposition for Dean and quickly take an overview. This one's not much of a story, but it gets a little bit into, here's what's better about the Dean technology. Here are some successful criteria. If you think about what the technology does for an industrial supplier, there are, of course, always assumptions that go into thinking about the calculation. So here we are. We're going to layer sustainability into this story, and we're going to get pretty directly to a business case to buy based on these assumptions. So operating hours, always, changeable in terms of how we do it. And it's always useful when you're having these presentations to customize them, to make it interactive so that a customer conversation has you adapting this for what the customer thinks is real. But now we get into the specific GHG elements. And it's a good idea, when you're having a GHG conversation, you might want to establish some broad parameters. You might have done this well by call prep. Do they have GHG goals? Well, if I thought about it beforehand, I probably already know. I might know what their targets are. Maybe they're somewhat more ambitious here. Maybe they're somewhat less. They may know something about the emissions of their plant. Now, is that important to illustrating the advantage? Not necessarily. But it is a good way to sort of understand whether the person you're talking to, is already thinking about it. So, we made some assumptions. If you don't know what this is, we're glad to sort of update it. We've used benchmark assumptions on emissions, and there's no drawback to using benchmark assumptions. If you can learn something better, right? If you can, learn what their emissions are, clearly interactively changing that and thinking about what that's worth is a good thing to do when it comes to the outcomes. Now, finally, there's this question here, have you thought about carbon credits? And that's really a segmentation question, because in this value proposition, I'm going to talk about emissions regardless, but I'm going to add a value driver if they've already thought about carbon credits, because if they thought about it, it's reasonable to think about saving them money that they're beginning to consider spending to cut their emissions. So I'm going to keep that at yes, and we get into a value story. We've got the differentiators, we've got value created, and a few key parameters. These are, and you'll notice there are 4 value drivers here. So there's fuel cost, but there's an emission cost. We'll look at that directly in a minute. Each one of the value drivers has its own slide. So this is direct fuel cost reduction, but now I've got a value driver for reduced carbon footprint. And the value that's going into this, frankly, that's an old price of carbon credits, but you'll see very directly this is being used in this case as a value driver. And again, changeable, think about it. And this, this again is a case where maybe you're also trying to understand the investment, understand the costs. But to roll all that up, a good value summary in this case gets it both the dollarized, in this case, could be euroized value, and it gets to the impacts, the sustainability impacts. And we've chosen to highlight both emissions reduction as well as water savings, just in case that's a goal that they have. And so you can think of this value proposition as working one way, and it's a very compelling value case when you've got all 4 value drivers in. Or if I'd made a different choice back when I asked him about carbon credits, maybe I'm not ready to talk about that being dollarized, but I still have a good value summary at the end, and I'm still drawing on the strong business case for this product, and I'm still highlighting the emissions. So, case 1. Let's switch a little bit, and let's switch to a situation that is a problem that's not fictional, but a problem that, but a product that is a little bit fictional. And we're in a second value proposition here. Let me just look at it this way. And as I look at this particular value proposition is for bioplastics. Yes, there are plastics made from biological substances. Green Genes Bioplastic is an innovative provider of plastics. They sell to large standalone bottle manufacturers who sell to brands. And the problem in this really comes through their value chain. You'll notice all we have is their downstream value chain. They sell to bottle manufacturers who sell to branded drink suppliers who sell to consumers who dispose of waste. And the problem in this value chain with compostable bioplastics actually comes at the time wastes are disposed, because these compostable bioplastics emit a lot less CO2 when they're composted. But the problem is not all bottles are composted. And so there are some other problems that you'll see in the value proposition. Now, this is a scope 3 problem. The biggest part of the problem we're going to address is down here. And the problem in the value chain is the brand may be, in this value chain, the brand may be the one that cares the most, because they are a consumer brand, about the disposal characteristics of their bottled drinks. The bottle manufacturer will want to be aware of that, and the bioplastics manufacturer is talking to the bottle manufacturer. So we're going to look at a value proposition for a value chain. In this case, always going in, we want to think about a few parameters here. So I've got a bottle manufacturer, Acme packaging. And it's useful when you're thinking about this you're thinking really about the value proposition, both for your direct purchaser, but trying to help them with a value proposition for their customer. So we've actually, set this up, and it's a good way to set it up to think about annual volumes for our direct customer, but also annual volumes for maybe one of their brands. Okay. Now, there are a few other operating parameters, simple assumptions like the weight of the bottle, the average price that the bottle producer receives per bottle. This is all kind of good fodder for call prep. And you'll notice, all important in call prep, the bottle manufacturer is currently buying compostable plastic, but we're about to propose a better bioplastic solution for them. So the question is, in a value chain, how do you think about value where it's all really on the revenue side, and some of it is downstream in the value chain? So we'll think about, and there are always two ways to realize value from something that's better on the revenue side. So we've set this up so we can really go at this in more than one way. The way I think we've done it is kind of a pretty natural way, that the bottle producer paying more for the plastics, may be looking to realize a higher price when they sell to the brand. So we'll set that up so that their value is coming from higher price. The brand may think about it in different ways. And you'll see this is kind of a situation where compostable bioplastic, or at least compostable bioplastic in its current form, may not be all that it's touted to be. So the brand might be motivated a little bit less out of greed and a little bit more out of fear that when this story emerges, they might actually lose some volumes. But again, set it up so that if we wanted to talk and we wanted to think about them charging more for something more sustainable, they could. So then we get into a bit more of a value story for Acme Packaging, and think about this as a good meeting agenda. Let's understand your sourcing strategy. Let's have a little bit of an overview of the scene before we look at how you can build value for your brands as well as for your own operations. So the roadmap to value, as you can see, chapters in this story. Let's look at their sustainability strategy. Let's get the customer talking and collaborating before we look at the value and before we look at the quantified value in the chain. A little bit of storyline on compostable bioplastics. But as we transition into what's the challenge here, and now we get into it, not all bioplastics end up composted. They work very well when they're composted, but up to 20% of bioplastic bottles end up in landfill. And it turns out that a lot of landfills in the US are anaerobic. And the problem with anaerobic and the current plastic is that methane emissions are actually worse. So this problem of methane emissions is really what this novel innovation is trying to address. That they've come up with a better bioplastic that reduces methane emissions substantially. As I say, a fictional product. But you can see how this story sort of spins itself out in terms of we're introducing a product and we're going to look at what the elements are in terms of this product, in terms of quality of packaging, the fact that it's compostable, but it's got this innovation where up to 90% of methane emissions can be reduced in an anaerobic landfill. So that's really the context going into a conversation about what it might mean to their business. So you'll see again the call prep items that we hit earlier going in. And now we begin to get to the story. What's the value for the brand and what's the value for the bottle manufacturer? The brand story is about fear. It's about, hey, did you realize that with conventional, not compostable plastics, that there's an emission factor on those, that's high, 80,000. If 10% of bioplastics go in anaerobic landfill, the emissions coming from current bioplastics can actually be higher than that of conventional plastics. That's the quantitative impact. And that's really coming at this from an angle that's almost a, compostable bioplastics, nice, but are they really what they cracked up to be? And what happens when your customers actually realize that that a lot of purchasers, even though they may be composting, a lot of purchasers are throwing them away and they're emitting methane, because methane is far more greenhouse gas emitting per metric ton than CO2. So what's then the claim? The claim is, if you switch, you're avoiding a problem. You're avoiding a lost demand problem. And, potentially that could be large and disastrous. Maybe I want to take that down a bit, but I still see very substantial value to the brand of de-risking their purchase of bottles. What is that ultimately worth? Kind of a simple cost benefit tab based on the potential loss in sales. It may cost you $5 million more a year to buy our improved, better bottles with this better material. If I'm the bottle manufacturer, ultimately this benefit is huge to the brand. And it's important for the bottle manufacturer to see this, because the bottle manufacturer is thinking, gosh, this is more expensive. How do I charge more for it? This is how. So then we get to the value for the bottle manufacturer, and sort of driving through their value chain. Their value driver's a little different. So higher bottle price, I think we already baked that in, but then production efficiency. And then as you think about their value drivers, potentially a 10% price premium that they might charge on this bottle. It was already baked into the numbers we just saw for the brand. But then ultimately, this is about some production efficiencies as well. The production efficiencies don't overwhelm the extra cost of the plastic. And then I think it's reasonable when you're thinking about charging higher prices to consider, well, there may be some marketing expense to go along with it. So when you look for the bottle manufacturer, Acme Plastic, what you're seeing is a classic waterfall where, despite there being a much higher price of the new improved plastic, there is net value added due to they're charging a higher price, and hey, you're getting some, and that price has a marketing expense, but there's also a production efficiency. So as I say, important to the value chain, important in thinking about brands. Let's look at a third value proposition, and then we'll wrap things up. The third one is for air freight. And so this particular example is for many companies, scope 3 emissions from transportation are high. So Langley Air Freight specializes in this. But if you've ever looked at sustainable air fuels, they're really expensive. And right now, using them is voluntary. So Langley, and there are real offerings like this out there, Langley has some sustainable air freight offerings. But as I say, they can be very expensive. The fuel can be, 3, 4, 5 times the cost of conventional fuel. So that works out to be a lot. So this is a different kind of value proposition. It's a value proposition to explore a given customer's situation and to see how important value might be to them. So call prep is a little bit more extensive. Let me understand, of course, who they are. I might be selling to, it's air freight, and maybe I'm going to go manufacturing. So I'm selling to International Lobster because, hey, they move a lot of their product by air freight. And they're, of course, in the specialty manufacturing space. So you're seeing the changes this time as I make them, just to highlight it. A few other items that I can get from public sources on what their GHG goals might be. Even, do we know how important air freight is in their scope 3 emissions? Do they have scope 3 targets? But then I get through this value proposition. I have a few assumptions about the customer, but they're things I can find on Yahoo Finance and in the public domain. We get very directly into some air freight assumptions and good discovery. We can even think about pricing In call prep, we're going to look in a minute at 3 value drivers here, but I've got more than one option. I've got a cargo zero shipment option, and I've got a carbon neutral option, and they both have a pretty high price in terms of the net cost versus conventional shipping. So as we move our way through this value prop, we can then think about, again, 4 chapters, their goals, their value of meeting the goals. Then how do they begin to think about sustainable air freight? So this is the value conversation. This is, once you've established the value conversation, here's the price. So I won't be able to show all of this as we go, but you can get a sense of the storyline. Air freight, important. Air freight, expensive. The broad sort of context for the conversation. And the big elements here are that measuring these freight emissions more and more important, right? So having the customer conversation about their perspective, seeing if the assumptions you made, presumably by looking at their sustainability report, that you've done your homework, right? Before you get into, okay, now let's look at the value of meeting goals. And this one's a very simple set of value drivers. We already saw them: investors, customers, employees, right? Where meeting sustainability goals can be very important to International Lobster because they are a brand, they care about their investors, their customers, and their employees. So what's the value they get out of meeting those goals? Well, it's based on a few assumptions, but we've got 3 value drivers. And here's the first one, that by improving their sustainability, there's going to be an important impact. This is one of the ways to think about the investor value on their cost of capital. McKinsey's written a lot about this. You know, they talk about there being a 10% lower cost of capital here. And we've used some standard cost of capital measures that are specific to International Lobster to get at this. Now, we can't claim we're going to improve this by 10%, but talking about this as the overall value in the context of their ESG goals, we might say, okay, our emission standards, 35% of your goal, or 35% of what you're trying to do. Because here's the overall advantage of this. The overall advantage, you know, we make for your business to be 59 million a year. Have you thought about it? Have you measured it? Same idea when we get to revenue growth. And sometimes these are fear, sometimes this is about brands. Same idea when we get to talent. How can we improve your value based on talent value drivers? But now here, 3 simple value drivers to then get into a conversation about what that might mean over time, but then get directly to a conversation about some products. And I'm going to stop the conversation here, but you can imagine from the value props you've seen before that having established value, we can then start to ask questions about whether these improved products actually justify the added expense. And that can help segment. That can help persuade. So just to step back, what I will do again, let's see, is just conclude with a few observations. First observation, sustainability value. Identify it, quantify it, dollarize it, euroize it. There are many sustainability value drivers. And then we're glad to say at LeveragePoint, we've worked on a lot of these value drivers with different clients and situations over the years. We're here to brainstorm. For any of our current clients, we're glad to do a sustainability workshop with you. Second, there are some best practices for communicating sustainability and value propositions. So as you think about this, I hope you saw some of these elements in the value propositions we just looked at, but think about their goals. Think about discovery. Think about what are your good qualitative messages. Have slides with impacts. Have interactive stories so you can collaborate. Have links to supporting collateral. Whoops, sorry. Next, carbon emissions and dollarizing sustainability value. As we say, there are a lot of segments here. We're not yet at the point where there are a lot of sort of truly required emission reductions, but there are a whole lot of voluntary commitments. And then there are a whole lot of companies who have limited to no emission commitments. So we think about the segmentation here as, we're moving toward this world with required commitments where there will be impacts, where they may be trying to avoid buying offsets, where you're talking about including offset or inset prices. And remember, the value of directly reducing their emissions, or the value of reducing their emissions within their supply chain, may be higher than the cost of offsets or insets. A lot of these same ideas apply when you get to voluntary emission commitments. And I think here, it's some of these ideas related to carbon credit purchases. When will they begin to think about that? But again, it's back to they're probably thinking consciously about higher quality emission reductions. And even though they're voluntary, these questions of what works best for them. Now, that can be a pretty different conversation from those with no commitments, and some are in denial. So understand, you may want to pose that in a slightly different way. So as we think about this, 6 takeaways: product differentiation. Understand your product. Look at your cost savings. Identify, quantify, communicate your company's differentiation. Know your customer, and think about your value prop use case as you consider being more transparent. So with that, didn't leave much time, Nick, but here we go.
No worries. Great. I just want a big thank you to Peyton for not only sharing these important insights, but also how sustainability impacts can be quantified and communicated using the LeveragePoint platform. And as Peyton mentioned, if anybody in the audience would like to see a sustainability value proposition in action, let us know in the exit survey. There's a question right there, and we can schedule one for you and your team. As we're running up against the hour, we don't have time for many questions. This is an important topic, and there's a lot of questions about it. So we'll be sure to answer them one-on-one offline. So with that, Peyton, I think it makes sense to move on to the next slide, which is next month's webinar. So we're going to be joined again by Bob Apollo. So make sure you pre-register next on the exit survey. He's going to be talking about strategies for building, cultivating, and scaling a modern sales organization with a value-centric mindset. Should be a really exciting one, especially for those on the sales and marketing side. So make sure you pre-register in the exit survey. And with that, that's it for us today. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. Special thank you to Peyton for his insights, and from all of us here at LeveragePoint, have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.